ค่ะ
สวัสดีค่ะ
Good morning, distinguished guests and delegates. It is a great honor for me, on behalf of Food Innopolis and TMA, to welcome all of you to Food Innopolis International Symposium 2020 under the theme of the Quest for Sustainable Food System. I am Khemarin Jantasorn.
And I am Natisha Chantautit. We are pleased to be the master of ceremony for today's event. TMA has organized the third Food Innopolis International Symposium in collaboration with Food Innopolis as a part of National Science and Technology Development Agency under the Ministry of Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation.
In today's gathering, the event will be focused on, first, connecting local, regional, and international food clusters to enhance and strengthen the global network of food innovation. Second, providing a forum for regional and international professionals, as well as startups to show and share the technologies. And the last one, exploring the business opportunities.
Before we get started, we would like to invite the executives from both Food Innopolis and TMA to give a warm welcome to all participants. Please welcome Asst.Prof.Dr. Akkharawit Kanjana-opas, Vice President of National Science and Technology Development Agency, and Ms. Wanweera Rachdawong, the Chief Executive Officer of Thailand Management Association. Please welcome.
Sawadika and good morning. Welcome to FIIS 2020. Once again, it's Dr. Akkharawit Kanjana-opas, CEO of Food Innopolis, and it's me, Wanweera, CEO of TMA, as a co-host for this conference. This year, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the social distancing policy, we have to turn our conference online. But since the on-ground participant is also limited, it's so very unfortunate that I mentioned earlier that it has to be the virtual forum. Hopefully next year, if the situation improves and we will be able to come back to the on-ground, to meet people in person again next year. Anyway, we still have a very satisfactory turnout of speakers, thanks to both our local and international friends who are so very eager to contribute. On the other hand, it's a blessing in disguise, I have to say, that they can make decisions so easily, easier to go online with us. Otherwise, everybody is so busy, as we all know. This year we have altogether 34 speakers, 22 international and 12 Thais from 15 countries altogether around the world joining us at this 3 days conference. And even more exciting to say is the number of the registered participants at close to 1,000. Whoa. Dr. Akkharawit, anything to say about that and the content we are going to experience during these 3 days, please?
Thank you very much and good morning again. Everyone, I'm sure that in some part of the world it would be good afternoon or good evening even. So as Wanweera said, this year we changed quite drastically from the face-to-face meeting to become the online conference. But that turned out to be another step of outreaching to the communities worldwide, where we have the nearly 1,000 participants to join. So as the mentioned by the MC early on, that the objective of this international symposium is actually to connect, to provide the information, to share experiences. So don't let the social distancing policy, don't let the COVID-19 pandemic preventing us from sharing, from joining the event. So we hope that with this situation and with this kind of technology, we should be able to bring out the best of information from all over the world to share to the community of the food innovation ecosystem.
I learned that we have number of very high-profile speakers speaking at this forum. We are so lucky, as I mentioned earlier, that due to the social distancing policy and the restriction in the travel, we get that time quite easily this time. So they don't have to travel all the way to Bangkok. Spend like maybe a week or so. With the traveling and this conference on ground for 3 days. So it's a blessing in disguise, so to say. And hopefully, you will join us the whole program. As I mentioned earlier, that there are speakers that you should not miss along the 3 days conference. Right, Dr. Akkharawit?
Yes. We have a full program for 2.5 days. So ranging from the innovative food trend from the speakers, as well as the sustainability issue. I hope that you will join us for the entire 2.5 day program.
Okay, I think that should be the wrap for our introduction and our welcome to the conference. I hope that you would enjoy the whole conference, the entire 2.5 days with us here in Bangkok from the team at FI Food Innopolis and TMA. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Asst.Prof.Dr. Akkharawit and Ms. Wanweera, for the welcome speech and introducing the overall of the events.
Today, the first session, the speaker will share the overall world's food business in the future. We are honored to welcome another expert who will be presenting on this session, The Future World of Food. Please welcome Mr. Quinault Childs, Research Director, Future Foods Lab Institute for the Future, United States.
Hi, my name is Quinault Childs, and I'm the Research Director for the Food Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future. Today, I'm going to be presenting some of our research on the next decade of food in the climate crisis. But first, let me give you a little context on how we work. IFTF is a nonprofit research group who focuses on uncovering long-term futures. So essentially what we do is we help organizations think usefully about the future. Now, our end goal is not to predict the future, but rather to understand some of the many ways that small systemic changes that are emerging today might eventually impact the world of the future, and then to think strategically about how to react to those changes. We work by creating forecasts, scenarios, artifacts from the future, and even experiential futures. We're driven by qualitative research methods, which means that we don't estimate likelihoods or put probabilities on things that might happen, but we focus on how people react to innovation and how people react to change. We work with a large array of companies, organizations, and institutions. And part of the advantage of doing so is that we have researchers who can understand the tangential links between all these different domains. So for example, maybe an insight gained in the automobile industry will eventually spark an insight in the agricultural industry. Or a new technology that's already familiar in the insurance industry might be totally novel when applied to utilities. And this sort of cross-combinatorial research is integral to good futures thinking. A really good way to start thinking about future possibilities is simply to ask yourself, what's already happening over there that might also be applied over here in a new or useful way? The Food Futures Lab is a group within the Institute that specifically researches change in the global food system. The goal of research like that which I'll be presenting today is to uncover those unexpected ways that people are adapting to big changes, so especially things like climate effects. We also do global research on the future of eaters, of nutrition, food supply chains, and all sorts of different things. Our organization, IFTF, was started 52 years ago. So that was a time of great technological change, when the first rockets were going to the moon and the internet was still in its infancy. In fact, IFTF was spun out of the RAND Corporation, where many of our original founders were involved in research developing the ARPANET, which was the early predecessor to today's internet. And their key realization was that this new piece of technology might actually have implications far beyond just scientific study. It might reshape our society, our businesses, and our way of life. IFTF was developed as a dedicated place to consider and anticipate those changes. And that's essentially the same process we work with today, thinking about how today's technologies, how today's social structures, policies, and discoveries might reshape the world we live in, just like the internet did decades ago, and still is. When it comes to food, the social and demographic changes can be just as consequential as the technological changes that we see. Since the founding of IFTF, we've evolved into a full-fledged futures thinking institute. Now, we get the term futures thinking or futurism or futurology from the science fiction author H.G. Wells. And actually, a lot of our work is somewhat related to science fiction in that both fields are concerned with a wide array of possibilities. But where science fiction is focused on entertaining, what we do is focused on strategizing. So Wells said that all the new inventions he was experiencing at the time were coming, he said, crowding along. And yet it was only after something has hit us hard that we actually set about dealing with it. Now, this was well over 100 years ago. And at the time, he was talking about the shocking effects that the new invention of the automobile was having on society around him. So there's been a need for this sort of thinking as long as there's been new technology. And with each wave of change, there comes a societal and cultural shift. The role of futures thinking groups like ours is to help anticipate how those changes and how those shifts might actually play out. Like I mentioned, though, it's critical to keep in mind that we are not trying to predict the future. And that's simply because nobody can predict the future. Really, it's useless to try and do so because the only certainty in prediction is that you'll be wrong. And what's more, you don't know how you'll be wrong. So instead, we think in terms of what we call the cone of possibility. And this is a framework for thinking about the future in a more useful manner than just thinking up sci-fi scenarios. We know that the further out we look into the future, the more uncertainty there is. So, for example, I feel pretty confident that tomorrow people will still be drinking coffee. But in 10 years, there's a non-zero possibility that they might not be. For example, what if a coffee blight deals a blow to the world's supply and it becomes a rare commodity? And in 50 years, who knows? Maybe by then people will be drinking something like coffee, but it will be assembled molecularly rather than grown from a plant that's planted in the ground. So we can divide up this cone into three sections. We have the probable, which is most likely to happen. We have the plausible, which is, sure, we could see that happening. And then we have the merely possible, which is just those things that are in the realm of possibility. And the further out we look into the future, the more possibility space there is within each of these different categories. So why practice foresight at all if it just gets vanishingly harder to think about what might happen in the future? Well, among the many different futures that are in the cone of possibility, we can also identify preferred futures. And those are the general directions that we want to move towards. And in fact, we can strategize to get closer to them. Now, even if we get the future wrong, which we definitely will, this practice is very useful for navigating closer to those preferred futures. So today, I'll be covering a couple of futures from the next decade or so of the climate crisis and examine how food can actually act as a compass to get us closer to those futures those futures that we do in fact prefer. Now, one of the core concepts of futures thinking can be summed up by the sci-fi writer William Gibson. Remember, I said I'd be referencing a lot of those. And he says, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And we think that's a practical thing to keep in mind while thinking about the future. Essentially, it means that the future doesn't just happen overnight. The things that will be big innovations, big influences over the next decade are likely already coming into existence today, or they are in existence today as experiments or pilot programs, maybe startups, or even just personal projects that some smart people are hacking away at in their free time. This sort of innovation is what we call a signal of change. A signal of change is a small or local innovation that has the potential to scale up and change the world. So at IFTF, much of our foundational research involves searching for and examining and extrapolating the effects of these signals of change. I'll be introducing a lot of them today. So every time you see one, ask yourself, how might the world change if this innovation were to scale up, if this innovation were to catch on and spread around the world? Another guiding principle of futures thinking is that any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And that's because if a forecast does make sense instantly, it's probably just a rehash of what's already going on. It's probably a new disguise on what you're already familiar with. So ridiculousness or unfamiliarity is actually a good indicator of thinking about a useful future. And I like to think of futures thinking sort of as a form of inoculation. So just like we take vaccines and through that expose our bodies to a strange signal in preparation for the inevitable and unpredictable invasion by viruses, we can imagine ridiculous, yet still plausible, futures to prepare ourselves for these strange futures that will inevitably arrive at. And to illustrate this point, we can go back in time to the year 1965, when this illustration was printed in the Sunday comics. So here is one vision that was commonly echoed about the future of food. How will we produce more food? A question that we still hear invoked all the time today. Now, this illustrator saw synthetic food as the promise of tomorrow. So they've created some delicious petro pizza and some fake bacon. Now, at the time, this was purely science fiction. Most people thought of it in the same realm as houses on Mars or flying cars. At that time, this was, in fact, a ridiculous future. Yet, that comic strip has an uncanny resemblance to many of today's grocery carts. So we can start to see how the visions and forecasts that we put forth about the future and the future of food really do have a big impact on what ends up as our reality. We envisioned a once ridiculous future of plentiful, cheap food, and that's exactly what we ended up with. Lastly, I think this is a good lesson of why identifying preferred futures really matters. Our images, our concepts, and our shared ideas of the future tend to be the ones we gravitate towards, even if unintentionally. So developing forecasts that do imagine a better future, especially in the face of climate change, can play a role towards actually getting to those futures or actually getting closer to those futures. So enough forecasts of climate doom and gloom. Let's talk about how we can eat our way out of the climate crisis. So this body of work is called Eating Our Way Out of the Climate Crisis. Now, I've pulled a couple of forecast areas out of the larger report, and unfortunately, I won't have time to cover that report in its entirety today. However, it is available to the public on our website at IFTF.org, and I'll put that website back up at the end of this presentation. The research question that informed this report was, what are the emerging adaptations and solutions to climate effects that we're starting to see in the way people grow, process, and consume food? We know that the next few decades will be an era of climate strife. But we also know that people are adaptive and people are resilient, and that everyone has to eat. As people start to grapple with the many ways that climate change will change the food system, we'll also see a lot of innovation all up and down the value chain. So, for example, the wildfires that we've been seeing in California and Australia and elsewhere over the past couple of years are having dramatic impacts on agricultural labor. Meanwhile, the increased heat and more arid conditions in some tropical regions are changing the viability of some specialty crops like cocoa and coffee. And even the way that humans react to a changing environment, from politics to personal decision-making, present opportunities for resilient innovations. This quote here sums it up nicely. We are all the authors of the climate crisis. Now, that's not necessarily about blame, but rather it's speaking to the fact that we can use our role in the food system to move towards a future that is innovative, that is sustainable and that is definitely delicious. So with that in mind, the first forecast area that we'll explore is the new way that food influencers are evolving towards becoming a new breed of plant-based tastemakers. Now, when we hear the word influencer, especially today, we tend to think of TikTok or Instagram, the social media celebrities that are all over the place today. But here I'll be talking about how the same concepts will be increasingly adopted by brands, by chefs and restaurants, and by food innovators in order to sway public opinion and affect deep cultural change. So one of the crucial domains this is developing within is in meat consumption. As the environmental impact of meat production is increasingly under scrutiny, a growing number of people are looking to global meat systems as sort of an easy lever for climate change solutions. But nothing in the climate crisis is easy. It's not possible to just turn off global demand for meat. So instead, we're seeing the evolution of these influencer tactics that are aimed at changing cultural values that will sway meat consumption far upstream. Research from economist Jason Lusk points to the truth that current disagreements that entangle personal identities and food consumption are going to be increasingly swayed by cultural values and by tribe identities. So essentially, issues around what to eat are not going to be approached with neat scientific solutions. And that's the core driver here. When people turn to meat as a climate solution, they cannot expect to treat it as an easy win. The key story of this forecast is that the identity politics that seem maybe trivial today, they can easily grow into deeply entrenched behaviors around food in the future. So we think of meat being a manly or maybe a high-class food product. It might seem a little preposterous, but research shows that these convictions are growing. Meanwhile, as traditional meat value chains are publicly taking more of the blame for a significant portion of carbon equivalent emissions, the decision to eat meat, or the decision not to eat meat, will become an increasingly important one. And when you combine these two factors, politics and identity plus meat as sort of a charged food item, it will make it hard to just reduce meat consumption as a simple climate lever. Instead, savvy businesses and organizations and governments who do want to reduce meat consumption will copy some of the tactics of social media influencers, especially those who are able to cross party lines and navigate these tricky identity politics. And so here are some of those signals I was talking about. So again, these are the early ways we can see this forecast starting to develop. Here, for example, we see Beyond Meat, a plant-based meat company who created a branding campaign that brought in different famous athletes to talk about their plant-based diets. And in doing so, they reframed the narrative. They challenged the assumption that eating red meat is tied to masculinity, rather than simply focusing on the climate benefits of their product, which are there. It uses an existing signifier of masculinity, sports or athleticism, and it ties this to their plant-based product before it can be categorized along pre-existing identity lines. Here's another signal. It's Eric Castro's Instagram. It's called How to Be Vegan in the Hood. And it pulls values of a vegan diet away from the elitist, affluent, and primarily white trend that it's been known as, especially over the past couple of decades. And it celebrates the deep history of plant-based eating that already exists in African American and Latino culture. Eric's also reshaping the narrative. Rather than trying to send people to the existing identity, he ties veganism to his own identity, and he creates a new base out of it. Now remember, the point of these signals is essentially to play out a little thought experiment. So when you see them, ask yourself, what if this trend scaled up? What if it evolved? Again, it's not about whether the specific example here succeeds or if it fails, but it's really about whether the core concept takes off. So with that in mind, this signal comes from Germany, where the Minister of the Environment enacted a policy to ban meat from being served at official government functions. Now, you can probably imagine how much of a cultural shift that would demand in a country that's famous for meat-heavy cuisine. But you can also imagine if this signal scaled up. and if it wasn't just a single government, if it wasn't just based in Germany, if it wasn't the single government behaving this way, but say many organizations turning the tide of institutional purchasing away from meat products, culture could swiftly follow suit from there. And lastly, we see a signal from the US military. And here, a group of soldiers have petitioned the logistics agency of the US military to provide them with vegan meals or vegan MREs. One of the arguments of this group is that eating meat exposes them to additional violence in a context where they're already oversaturated with violence. They also point out that it's actually healthier, and the military is currently facing a recruiting problem due to the general unhealthiness of some citizens. So again, the influence here is about tackling the problem from multiple angles. Now, this type of influencer, far from being a social media star, will still be an important force in altering food cultures. So with those signals in mind, let's return to that quote that I mentioned at the beginning of this forecast. We are the authors of our climate futures. So those making the preferred futures will increasingly adopt these tactics and language from today's influencer culture. The brands and organizations of the future that want to approach this as a climate matter will become a much deeper part of our lives and our identities, especially when it comes to climate change. So one way to really integrate these forecasts and really think about them deeply is to sort of put yourself in them. So imagine for a moment that you're in this future, 10 years from now, say, a future in which the food decisions you make are almost entirely informed by individual influencers who are all vying for different platforms and all vying for different political identities. Rather than basing decisions off of traditional advertising or information, your decisions are wrapped up tightly in your social identity. If those identity influencers are a force for good, they can be a serious way to change climate impacts through the food you eat. Our next forecast is called Climate Proofing Culinary Traditions. And this forecast explores the ways that chefs, producers, and companies are using resilience and innovation as a way to preserve and continue traditional foods and traditional food cultures. So the key story here, the key story of this forecast, is that climate change will not only damage our environment, not only our infrastructure, and not only our health, but also our cultures. And of course, that includes our foods. After all, food is foundational to many aspects of our cultures. We may also lose iconic ingredients and crops like wine, coffee, or maple syrup, things that convey cultural value. I mean, imagine France without wine, or Vermont without maple syrup. But out of all this climate chaos, we'll also see totally new ways of creating recipes, rituals, and other food cultures. And some of those will simply be the act of transplanting cultures to new areas. But many more will actually be entirely new food cultures and new cuisines born out of the effects of climate change. And those who succeed in this sort of great remixing will be the ones who can co-create, who can borrow from multiple food cultures and learn to make totally new foods in totally new ways. We can see this starting to happen already in projects like the American Chestnut Foundation, who created a genetically engineered chestnut varietal that is more resilient to climate change, as well as highly effective at sequestering carbon. However, they know that it won't catch on as a crop unless people see it as valuable and as tasty, like cultures did in the past. So they're also developing new recipes and new dishes that center the chestnut as an ingredient. In tandem with creating the new trees, they have held brunches and invited chefs to become familiar with the ingredient and start creating that culture that comes out of this new resilient crop. We can also see it happening in Africa, where the FAO drew on input from Mexican chefs to help popularize prickly pear as a food source when farmers in Madagascar were faced with severe droughts. So these Mexican chefs who have been using this ingredient for millennia were actually able to lend their knowledge to farmers and cooks and homemakers in Madagascar, who were then able to make a useful cuisine out of the product. And this sort of sharing of experience will open the door for new ways that food experience is valued. People who are already very familiar with resilient food production will increasingly find themselves in possession of extremely timely and extremely relevant solutions. So the next time a drought affects the crop somewhere, those chefs and experts from Mexico who are familiar with the prickly pear may be called in again to help update and make more sustainable the food culture of that area. We also see it in new technologies, like Atomo Coffee here, who are creating a drink that is actually molecularly identical to coffee, but it's synthesized from sustainable ingredients rather than through traditional coffee farming. This means that they can make coffee without the need for land and agricultural labor. It has the potential to change our rituals around these food and drinks like coffee. Today, we're used to buying coffee maybe based on its origin. But in this future, we might instead base our morning cup on how much land or how much water that coffee was responsible for using. This next one is a favorite signal of mine because it so clearly exemplifies the sort of combinatorial food cultures that I think will typify the future of climate resilience. Here, scientist Marissa McMahon and chef Ali Wax-Adams developed a fish sauce made from green crabs after discovering that ocean environmental change had led to a lack of traditional crab species in New England. So the crabs that fishermen there were used to pulling out had all but disappeared. So this team brought in experts from Venice to teach local fishermen about the species, experts who had been used to this species for, again, probably centuries or millennia. And then they created a traditional Vietnamese sauce from this new ingredient. So all of this was this blending of various cultural expertise that was needed to create the value chain for this entirely new product. And it was a product that was born explicitly out of climate change. And finally, we see the shifting of traditional producer regions. So for example, climate change has made it so that the country of Turkey can no longer produce hazelnuts quite as well as it once did. So plant breeders in the United States created a type of hazelnut that would thrive in the US, where very few hazelnuts are traditionally grown. In order to quickly scale up the market, they're working again with chefs and eaters to popularize fresh hazelnuts and to build a new regional identity around this ingredient. We expect to see the same story happen again and again as climate change makes certain regions totally unsuitable for traditional crops that grow there. And those places that can quickly develop a food culture around climate resilient varieties will be able to jump on big opportunities faster than those who are just creating the new crop or just creating the new resilient system. When they combine a new culture with it, that makes it a lot stronger. So consider the implications of this future. Food is at the foundation of civilizations. Our cultures, identities, and sense of self are all closely tied to our recipes, to our ingredients, and our food products. So as these change, try to think about how that changes the rituals and behaviors of everyday people. Now, it's easy to imagine a future full of vertical farms, but it's actually a lot harder to imagine how that alters, say, the ritual of a tourist family going apple picking in the fall. It's very easy to imagine a future of cell-grown meat, but it's a lot harder to imagine how that changes the culture of, say, shopping for meat at the deli. For a starting place, you can always look to the opportunity for combinatorial futures. These are the places where the expertise of one culture can actually step in and lend resilience to another, because those will be the instances of some of the greatest innovations in future food. So there you have two very different glimpses into the ways that people, food, and the climate crisis will all interact over the coming years. Now, if you want to see some of the other forecasts, I definitely recommend that you go to our website at IFTF.org, and you can read the full report there. You can also find our work looking into the futures of many different topics. So not only the future of food, but technology, emerging media, the future of cities, the future of work and education, and tons more stuff. You can also feel free to reach out to me via email at qchilds@iftf.org. And both of those resources are up on the screen now, so you can just screenshot that as well. So thank you for attending, and I hope you got a good glimpse into the future of the intersection between climate and our food systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Childs. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Before the next session begins, let's have a short break and we'll be back in a few minutes.